you know about the French Revolution, then you know that back when it first occurred, it was essentially funded by Protestant Swiss banking interests. And this money, according to Dr. Carol Quigley, was put into a revolution in France. That revolution utilized the ideology of naturalism, the ideology of the Enlightenment, to overthrow throne and altar. That has always been the Masonic dictum, to get rid of throne and altar, to install a secular republic based on naturalism and natural rights, supposedly. Now, in this inner group, there's a darker secret that actually is, in my view, more satanic. It is more scientific and technocratic. It's not by accident that technocracy goes back to these key figures like Robespierre, Saint-Just, Saint-Simon, these French theorists. And these French theorists are influenced by the technocratic Platonic philosophy. It goes all the way back to Plato's Republic. Plato's Republic is the first kind of Enlightenment attempt at setting up an ideal secularized system. This is the cause, the root of why there's so much revolution in the last 300-400 years. It's the final revolution. If you listen to my book series where I covered the Huxleys, where I covered Bertrand Russell, they talk about this revolution as the final revolution. If you're familiar with the Illuminati card game, it's interesting because that card game actually does posit that these different groups, as you're playing the game, these different groups are tools that you use to try to achieve world domination. So if there is an attempt to spark a battle between East and West, and I think this goes back to the Clash of Civilizations, Samuel Huntington, Bernard Lewis, these neocons, they've been talking about the inevitable clash of Eastern and Western civilizations. Now, Western civilization, of course, is problematic at its core, not so much just because of atheism, but there's actually a longer problem that goes back to, in my view, the Renaissance. If you go back to the Renaissance, that's where you begin to see the beginning of the implementation of syncretism, of Platonism, of these very radical ideologies into the West. Now, not everything in the Renaissance is bad. I'm not trying to oversimplify it. But what I'm saying is that the Renaissance magic tradition, the Neoplatonic tradition of the Renaissance, that has been at the core of the idea that there's an overarching religion behind all the world religions, this perennial religion. Perennialism is the same idea that's in Masonry, which sees religions as simply as tools for an inner coterie of elite to use. Different nobility, different states in the past in Europe have seen Freemasonry and religion in the same way. They could be tools to use to socially control. And so if you fast forward all the way up to modern France, modern Europe, these are, yes, they're secular and they're atheistic, but really at the root of these is something darker, a spiritual darkness. The problem with this inner spiritual darkness is that it's self-destructive. It can't maintain itself. It falls apart because it's anti-human, and it's being run by humans and ultimately being run by something beyond human, which is spiritual evil. Now, I want to add, too, that the Roman Catholic Church, especially in the 20th century, has gone in a very downward slope because of its acceptance of modernism, higher criticism, liberalism, and all these aspects that have tried to update it to the modern world and have been disastrous. You have the plummeting of people entering religious life, the plummeting of churches, the pedophilia crisis, which is really a manifestation of just the same toxic culture in the church itself, in the Roman Catholic Church I'm speaking of here. And that's why ultimately, in a cultural way, it's symbolic, right? The church burning. Again, I'm not saying it was a good thing. I'm just saying I see it as symbolic in the same way that many Catholics, when Benedict resigned, they saw lightning hitting the Vatican as symbolic, as a kind of omen, if you will. And so for hundreds of years, Europe has been under this bondage of not just secularism, but actually a kind of a Masonic Enlightenment view that is self-destructive. And so that's really what has to be abandoned here. The key thing to understand here is that secularism and the Enlightenment worldview are not neutral, organic worldviews that just sprang out of nowhere. They weren't just organic developments. They were actually funded by very powerful interests that comes up in Tragedy and Hope. It's not just banking interests in Europe. It's not just some religious sect. The Vatican was a big part of this. The Vatican was a big part of its own demise, of its own updating and adapting to the modern world. And people forget this. People overlook this. Yes, there was a Masonic opposition to the Vatican, but ultimately, if you look at the Renaissance tradition, how it accepted the ecumenism back then, right? The Renaissance was pre-ecumenism. Even back then, they were talking about how all the religions are basically the same. A lot of the luminaries of the Enlightenment, people at the Vatican, the Borgia popes spoke this way. The Medicis spoke this way. So the roots of Freemasonry, the roots of the kinds of revolutionary thought that took hold during the Enlightenment, that took hold during the French Revolution, the roots of that ideology are not just Hermeticists and alchemists of the Middle Ages. It goes back to the Renaissance. And this is what is often overlooked and ignored. This has been exposed in a lot of books if you look into the history of the Renaissance. And that was all done with papal approval. So if you want to talk about banking, if you want to talk about those kinds of problems, you can't overlook the Vatican itself. It's hypocritical to do so.